barbacoa, me la llevo en los 15 años. Me dicen el barbacoa, me la llevo en los 15 años. Aunque no conozca a nadie, yo como pa' todo el año. Aunque no conozca a nadie, yo como pa' todo el año.
The more I try not to think of barbacoa, the more it comes up like the smell Mother claims, like those bull's heads and hooves in the Mexico City meat market, an eye sticky with flies. How when someone says, "Don't look," that's exactly what you do. Celaya in Sandra Cisneros' Caramelo. Thank you for allowing our participation in this symposium in Australia from the Mexican Gulf state of Veracruz. From here, we look to the Gulf of Mexico to shift the shape and tenor of region, of nationalisms and understandings of globalization. Our literary historical charting of Mexican, Cuban, and U.S. Southern Gulf spaces builds on what Matthew Pratt Gutierrez calls an American Mediterranean, that, as Cuba's Jose Marti put it, is, quote, our Greece, preferable to the Greece that is not ours, end of quote. It's so profoundly our Greece that we can follow contemporary Veracruz poet Jose Luis Rivas's invocations of the Delphic oracle, Apollo, and Helen, assured that he never ceases to speak of El Tajín, Huracan, and Malinche. This vision of the Gulf as region seems to be taking hold. For our part, we've edited a Gulf section of World Literature Today, out this month, featuring writers from Choctaw Nation, U.S. Gulf South, Veracruz, Mayan Yucatan, and Havana. Our first publication from our Gulf Book Project just appeared in the Southern Literary Journal's relaunch as the more interdisciplinary South. New editor Sharon Holland calls for, quote, thinking of that entity called the South in circumgulfic terms, from the bottom up, rather than from the top down, end of quote. Our perspective draws from the region's trickster turtle, or from young indigenous men in Tales of the Corn Mother, so shocked to discover her scraping kernels from her legs into a bowl that we are unable to eat the grits she serves. The gaze from the bottom up is often transgressive, folkloric, disturbing, censored, unaccredited. Looking to Gulf ritual calendars, from Carnival to Todos Santos, our South of the South ofrendas embrace some very traditional bedeviling discourses in an effort to unsettle ideas of region and nation across a region that has been a traumatic contact zone, a space of oil wealth and narco-trafficking, of extreme inequalities, ecosystemic dead zones, and untapped openings to the cross-cultural imagination. Our book project's initial cornbread ofrenda examines Mesoamerican bioengineering and diffusion of corn, which shaped Mississippian cultures to the north, with companion co-cropping, mound building, feathered serpent deities, the ball game, and more. Current cross-border northward migrations mark a re-indigenization of the U.S. along old paths. We read native tales of the origin of corn in contemporary indigenous writers like Briseida Cuevas Cobb, Yucatec Mayan, and Leanne Howe, Choctaw, to assemble ideas of a greater cornbread nation. Even as we align with John Smith and Scott Romine's recent call for submissions to an edited collection titled Against Cornbread Nationalism. Smith and Romine voice healthy fatigue with the, quote, endless stream of celebratory barbecue documentaries and popular books like the Cornbread Nation series, with their feel-good celebrations of authenticity and Southern identity that tend to flatter largely white and upper-class Southern readers, students, and donors. End of quote. We respect this intervention, even as we seek leverage in some of the discourse, to challenge the politics and sensibilities of its audiences, to nurture a transnational regional sensibility, an extended imagined community, and to question who is host and guest at any cornbread welcome table across the Gulf. And well, let's confess, we both carry a nostalgic delight in the cornbreads our mothers and grandmothers made, whether hand-prepared masa turned into fresh corn tortillas in Veracruz, or Tennessee hoe cakes, crackling bread, and pones. Mexico's Gulf shores were also a ground zero for plantation slavery in North America. Our book's Quimbombo ofrendas serve an occluded Afro-Mexican presence, and attend to patterns of Afro-Creole migration from Louisiana and Florida across the Gulf following the Seminole Wars, the Dred Scott decision, and Reconstruction's end. We're interested in Afro-Creole musics and the poetics of several Afro-U.S. poets who've embraced Mexico's freer shores. There are imaginative stakes here. Consider, for instance, the opening scene of Django Unchained, in which West Texas slaves, in the year following the Dred Scott decision, get pointers from the bounty-hunting liberator to follow the North Star to, quote, a more enlightened area of this country, end quote. Since southward flight across the Rio Grande was the surer journey to freedom, we ponder what North Star orientations make us miss. The exceptionalist City Upon a Hill narrative is a blindingly used-up national narrative. That's all in the book project. What we want to share today is a third charting of Gulf shores and Gulf-bound Rio Grande borders that responds to observations on barbecue that launched Jose Limon's American Encounters, Greater Mexico, the United States, and the Erotics of Culture, 1998. We engage the flesh and racial engendering of spaces where people become consumable matter, meat, carne, dishes to devour or throw away. Here, plantation and hacienda-shaped structures of knowledge and power set carnal, reincarnating gulfs between knower and known, subject and object, or as Octavio Paz put it, chingon and chingada, fucker and fucked. We turn to barbacoa and notions of the barbarous to trace carnivalesque modes of agency by which the historically fucked make cross-border lives matter anew amidst the carnage of tremendous structural violence. We look to narrative tropes of barbacoa along our eroticized border spaces, and to how women writers of the Gulf render long history of their lives not mattering. In texts such as Eudora Welty's The Wide Net, Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands, La Frontera, Sandra Cisneros' Caramello, Natasha Tretheway's Thrall, and Brenda Marie Osby's All Souls. We want to consider the institutional stakes of claims to a circumgulfic knowledge at a time when the humanities as a whole has lost legitimizing function. In 1517, 499 years ago, the Aztec Empire was attending to omens of its collapse. A flaming ear of corn seemed to bleed fire drop by drop, like a wound in the sky, till dawn. The deity Cihuacotl appeared, the nighttime voice of a weeping woman who drowned herself in her tears, crying, "O my sons, we are lost. Where can I hide you?" Then a final dread omen, the appearance of Tlacanzoli, or men squeezed together. Beings of several heads and diverse body parts merged monstrously into a single body. We, in our time and space compressed global moment, have a feel for the pressures and violence that would create these men squeezed together, and the wailings of grief that accompany them. Since we're all native to such pressures now, maybe we should be reading those who survived being squeezed together out of diverse corpora. Those New World Tlacanzoli who navigated conditions we face. In Cabeza de Vaca, the 1991 Mexican film based on Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca's 1542 narrative of engulfment in indigenous Florida, an early scene shows the 4 surviving members of the mission squeezed together in a cane-grated cage, reduced to captive flesh. Along a tidal creek, another wood-gated structure is perched several feet over a smoky fire. The camera focuses on the meat splayed atop the structure, the barbacoa, as the crop background registers its own carnal frame, the smoke-wafting hands and brown-tipped breasts of indigenous women turning the meat. Our captive narrative enters an erotics of culture in which we are as likely to be grilled as to consume the grill's smoke game. Inca Garcilaso de la Vega's La Florida, 1605, features a barbecue scene in its account of how the De Soto expedition, acquired its guide, who spent 10 years amongst Timucuans after being taken in search for Cabeza de Vaca and comrades. The action of La Florida begins as the indigenous leader decides to subject the captured Juan Ortiz to the barbacoa in a moment that becomes an erotic trope of American contact narratives. Quote, "When he saw many live coals made, he commanded that over them there be placed a grill-like wooden structure, una barbacoa, which stood a yard above the ground, and upon which they should put his captive in order to roast him alive. Thus it was done, and here the poor Spaniard, after being tied to the grill, la barbacoa, lay stretched out on one side for a long time. But at the shrieks of the miserable youth, the wife and daughters of the cacique rushed up, and, pleading with their lord and even scolding him for his cruelty, removed the boy from the fire. Not, however, before he was half baked, and blisters that looked like halves of oranges had formed on one of his sides. The women took him to their lodging and treated him with the juices of herbs." End of quote. This rescue doesn't last. The cacique pitmaster, having had his lips, nose, and ears cut off by Narvaez's men, kept remembering how, quote, "the Spaniards had cast his mother to the dogs and permitted them to feed upon her body, and each time he attempted to blow his nose and failed to find it, the devil seized him with the thought of avenging himself on Juan Ortiz." End of quote. Shortly before the final sacrificial fiesta, however, quote, "the eldest daughter, in order to carry out an idea of her own, secretly notified Juan Ortiz of her father's decision against him," end quote, and arranged his escape. We have to ask, where are the white women in Gulf literature who have ideas of their own, and who act upon their desires to provide refuge for black, Choctaw, or Mexican men along the racialized frontiers of white power? Barbacoa is another of those Taino words of first contact, like hammock, tobacco, hurricane, and canoe, that the Spanish used to name things they saw in Mexico, Florida, and South America. These days, most any barbecue cookbook will point to the word's entry into the literature from the island of Dominica. Quote, "They roast the flesh on sticks which they place in the ground like a grating or trivet over a pit. They call these barbacoas and place fire beneath." End quote. This from Rachlin's Barbecue USA. This observation from Oviedo's 1514 voyage found print in his Natural History of the West Indies. The cookbooks reproduced Theodore de Bry's engravings from 1591 based on Lemoyne de Morgue's Florida sketches from Fort Caroline, depicting Indians cooking fish on a wood-slatted barbacoa raised above a smoking fire. Barbecue USA cookbooks do not, however, go south to consider barbecue in the lives and tongues squeezed together in the pictographic writing of the Mexicas and the alphabetized written nahuatl of Historia General de las Cosas de Nueva España, the Florentine Codex, compiled by Bernardino de Sahagún. Sahagún's text presents Mexican practices of barbacoa in markets filled with, quote, "roasted meats and meats roasted underground." Barbacoa has a widespread history in Mexico. The states of Hidalgo, Puebla, Tlaxcala, and the Federal District are famed for their barbecue fairs. Here in Veracruz, several places with strong Aztec legacies are known for their barbecue fairs, especially Actopan and Xochimilco. Mexico may have to be considered the core of any deep barbecue nation, within which the U.S. South would be a northern region. Here in Veracruz, barbacoa is still smoked in its own steam in a big hole for as long as 12 hours. It's a tradition to eat in weddings and fiestas patronales in small towns. These photos are from a nearby secondary school graduation in the mountains, and we may see something of the cultural, social, and historical meanings attached to the events barbacoa and red rice.